Behind the holiness lies a quiet shadow. The Vatican, the Sacred Heart of Catholicism for over 2,000 years. It has its own bank, its own passports, its own laws and secrets that have never been told. A banker found hanging beneath a London bridge, pockets stuffed with cash. A Nazi officer vanishes carrying papers signed by a bishop. A man called the Black Pope, real but without a throne. Yet the Vatican has never given a clear explanation. And if you follow the missing records, the red wax seals, and the quiet corridors no one walks, you'll find that some parts of history aren't written in ink. They're written in silence. It was early morning in London, June 18th, 1982. A body hung beneath Blackfriars Bridge. The man's name was Roberto Calvi. His pockets were stuffed with bricks. His jacket held over $10,000 in multiple currencies, and the rope around his neck wasn't exactly subtle. Police weren't sure if they'd found a suicide scene or something out of a mafia novel, and in a way they had. Calvi wasn't just any banker. He was the head of Banco Ambrosiano, one of the most powerful private banks in Italy. But more importantly, his bank was closely connected to the Vatican, specifically the Vatican Bank, known formally as the Institute for the Works of Religion, which sounds very wholesome, until you learn it operates completely outside of international banking law. It doesn't report to the Italian government. It doesn't follow European regulations. It reports to the Pope. Yes, the Pope has a bank, and it's had some interesting accounting practices over the years. Back in 1982, Banco Ambrosiano was missing something about $1.3 billion. No receipts, no paperwork, just gone. Calvi was already under investigation for fraud, illegal transfers, and general financial shenanigans. Then he fled Italy with a fake passport. That's never a good sign. He was scared. He told friends his life was in danger. And less than 10 days later, he turned up dead in a way that looked like a warning. Now here's where it gets weird, or weirder. That bridge, Blackfriars Bridge. Some believe it wasn't just a location, it was a message. The Blackfriars were the nickname of Dominican monks, and also allegedly a symbol tied to Propaganda 2, or P2, a banned Masonic lodge, operating as a kind of secret shadow government in Italy. Calvi was a member, so were military leaders, business elites, and according to some, even men in robes behind Vatican walls. Then Calvi's secretary jumped out of a window. Files disappeared. Everyone forgot how to answer a phone. The scandal reached the Vatican quickly because the Vatican Bank wasn't just a bystander. It had helped Calvi set up offshore shell companies. It was the largest shareholder in his bank. And when the empire collapsed, the Vatican simply blinked. They released a short official sounding statement. Then nothing. No trials, no confessions, no refunds. It took 2 decades for Italian courts to officially rule Calvi's death a homicide. By then, most suspects had conveniently died, disappeared, or changed addresses to South America. No one was convicted. The money was never recovered. And the Vatican said not a word. In most countries, if you start a secret society full of politicians, bankers, and intelligence officers, you'll eventually get caught. In Italy, you get invited to lunch. This was propaganda due, better known as P2. It began as a traditional Masonic lodge, but by the 1970s, it had become something far stranger. Less gentleman's club, more shadow state. It was officially outlawed in 1976. But by then, it had already dug deep into the walls of power government, media military, and yes, even the Vatican. At its height, P2 had nearly 1,000 secret members. The list included cabinet ministers, judges, police generals, intelligence agents, and at least one man inside the Vatican Bank. His name was Bishop Paul Marcinkus. You'll hear more about him later. Piu's stated mission was the moral rebirth of Italy, which sounds noble until you read their real plans. They wanted to influence elections, undermine communism, control media outlets, and restructure the Italian constitution. Not exactly a Bible study group. And while the group operated in darkness, its fingerprints were all over Italy's weirdest scandals. The collapse of Banco Ambrosiano connected. The sudden rise of right-wing political parties influenced. Even false flag terrorist attacks during Italy's years of lead, possibly manipulated by P2 members within the intelligence services. But what about the church? Well, the line between religion and politics in Italy has always been flexible. And P2 understood that influence over religious institutions gave them moral cover, so they courted clergy. They infiltrated Vatican finances. They used the church's global network to move money and sometimes people. In 1981, Italian investigators finally raided the home of Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of P2. There they found the infamous list of members typed neatly on official letterhead. That list exploded across Italian newspapers. Suddenly, everyone was shocked and then very quiet. No one wanted to admit how far P2's roots had spread. Not in politics, not in business, and definitely not inside the church. The Vatican officially condemned Freemasonry, of course, has for centuries, but the actions of a few insiders suggested a more complicated relationship behind closed doors, and so another line blurred. Faith, finance, power, secrecy, and a group of men in suits pulling levers in the dark. The Vatican never confirmed or denied if anyone on that list worked for them, which in Vatican terms is as close to a maybe as you'll ever get. For centuries, the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, has been many things. Missionaries, scholars, educators, sometimes diplomats, sometimes spies. Occasionally, a bit too clever for their own good. Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits were created during the Counter-Reformation, a moment in history when the Catholic Church said, "All right, we've had enough of Martin Luther. Let's fight back," politely with Latin. The Jesuits took a vow of loyalty to the Pope, but they also operated with remarkable independence. They opened universities, debated philosophy, translated texts, and slowly became one of the most influential orders in Catholic history. And somewhere along the way, a nickname began to stick: the Black Pope, not because of any sinister robes or shadowy rituals. The name simply referred to the Jesuits' leader, the Superior General. He wore black, unlike the Pope in white. He answered directly to the Pope, but wielded power that felt a little too big for comfort, especially if you were a king. or a politician, or a pope who didn't like being questioned. By the 17th century, European monarchs had grown uneasy. The Jesuits were well connected, well traveled, and very good at persuasion. And people started to whisper, are they loyal to the church or loyal to themselves? That's when the real paranoia began. Rumors that the Jesuits were pulling strings behind the throne, controlling royal courts, meddling in elections. Some even said they had their own network of private intelligence. In 1773, the tension finally snapped. Pope Clement XIV, under pressure from several Catholic monarchs, officially suppressed the entire Jesuit order. He dissolved it, shut it down, which worked for a while. But 41 years later, the church quietly brought them back. Why? Because the world was complicated, and the Jesuits were useful, smart, discreet, loyal, and very, very good at getting things done. Fast forward to today, and the title Black Pope still floats around conspiracy forums and late-night radio shows, especially after Pope Francis, a Jesuit himself, became the first member of the order to sit on the papal throne. That's right. For the first time in history, the White Pope and the Black Pope became the same person. Cue dramatic music, or a soft Gregorian chant. In reality, the current superior general of the Jesuits isn't hiding in catacombs or issuing secret commands. He manages budgets, oversees universities, writes long emails in 5 languages. But the myth still lives. Because when power wears a collar and whispers in Latin, people start to imagine all sorts of things. At the end of World War II, Europe was a shattered continent. Cities were rubble. Borders had shifted. And somewhere in the chaos, people began to disappear. Not civilians, Nazis, hundreds of officers, SS agents, camp commanders. The worst of the worst vanished like smoke. Some were captured and tried. Many weren't. Instead, they resurfaced years later in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, living quiet lives with new names, new passports, and somehow new paperwork that looked extremely official. This was the network historians now call the rat lines, a series of underground escape routes that helped former Nazis flee Europe. And right at the heart of many of those routes was the Catholic Church, more specifically, certain clergy in Rome, Austria, and Croatia, working through churches' monasteries and Catholic aid organizations. The logic at the time was murky. Some said it was about mercy. Others claimed they were helping anti-communist refugees. And some, frankly, just didn't ask too many questions. One name comes up again and again: Bishop Alois Hudal, an Austrian cleric stationed in Rome. Hudal had access to the Vatican's networks and a very particular sympathy for former soldiers of the Reich. He helped them with shelter, paperwork, even Red Cross travel documents stamped by Vatican offices. Some of those he helped were simply soldiers, but others included convicted war criminals, like Franz Stangl, commandant of the Treblinka extermination camp. By 1947, the rat lines were in full motion. Ships left from Italian ports. Passports were issued under false names. And South America welcomed a quiet influx of European immigrants with unusual backgrounds. Now, to be clear, the Vatican, as an institution, has never admitted organizing the rat lines, but evidence suggests that at least some officials knew and looked the other way. In a world freshly divided by the Cold War, many in the church feared Soviet expansion more than Nazi fugitives. Some even believed these men could be useful in fighting communism abroad. Still, it raises uncomfortable questions. How many were helped? How high up did it go? And did silence become policy? The Vatican has never opened all the archives related to this period. Some documents remain sealed. Some were never written down, but survivors, journalists, and declassified intelligence files have pieced together enough to say the rat lines were real. Some led through Rome, and at least a few of them ran straight through the church's back door. By the early 20th century, the Vatican was in a strange position. Still powerful, still sacred, but technically homeless. For nearly 60 years, popes refused to leave the Vatican palace. Not because they were shy, but because they were in a very quiet war with the Italian state. See, when Italy unified in the 19th century, it took over Rome, which had been ruled by popes for centuries. The church lost its lands, its political power, and its pride. In return, the popes declared themselves prisoners of the Vatican, and they stayed there for decades. No ceremonies, no state visits, just Latin paperwork and long sighs in marble hallways. Then along came Benito Mussolini. In 1922, Mussolini seized power in Italy, marching with black shirts and grand promises. He wasn't exactly the church's ideal leader, but he had something they needed: a deal. On February 11th, 1929, the church and the fascist regime signed the Lateran Treaty. The Vatican finally became a sovereign city-state. It got its land back, all 44 hectares of it. It gained full independence, its own currency, its own laws, and yes, its own post office. In return, the church recognized Mussolini's government as legitimate. They dropped their claim to other territories, and the Pope agreed to stay out of Italian politics. Officially, behind closed doors though, the lines remained blurry. The church received state funding, Catholicism became the official religion of Italy, and Mussolini gained a stamp of moral approval, which looked very nice in newspaper photos. It was a marriage of convenience. Faith and fascism shaking hands in public, each hoping the other wouldn't ask too many questions. To Mussolini, the Lateran Treaty was a public relations victory. To the church, it was a restoration of dignity. To historians, it was a complicated compromise, especially when World War II arrived and Mussolini aligned himself with Nazi Germany. The Vatican would later insist it had always been neutral, and in some cases, it did help protect Jewish citizens and refugees. But its early cooperation with a fascist regime left a long, uncomfortable shadow. 1. The Church still steps around very carefully. Today, the Lateran Treaty is still in effect. Vatican City remains independent. Its sovereignty and silence are protected. And while Mussolini is long gone, his name still sits quietly in the footnotes of Vatican history, signed, stamped, and filed away, just like everything else. If you were trying to build a bank that looked perfectly legitimate on the outside, but quietly moved money for criminals, dictators, arms dealers, and rogue governments. You couldn't have designed a better front than the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, or simply BCCI. Founded in 1972, BCCI billed itself as a third world bank, global, inclusive, and modern. At its height, it operated in 78 countries. But beneath the glossy brochures and polite slogans was something very different. This was a bank that, according to investigators, engaged in fraud, bribery, money laundering, arms trafficking, and covert intelligence operations all at once. And yes, somehow, the Vatican's name ends up in the middle of it. Not publicly, not officially, but quietly and curiously. During the 1980s, both BCCI and the Vatican Bank appeared in overlapping financial investigations. Money had moved from one to the other, often through shell companies in Luxembourg, Panama, the Bahamas, anywhere with more palm trees than auditors. What was the money for? Good question. Some of it funded legitimate church activities. Some supported missionary work. And some just vanished. Journalists and financial watchdogs began asking questions. How did Vatican-linked funds end up inside one of the most corrupt financial institutions in modern history? Who signed the transfers? And why were so many accounts opened under pseudonyms? Naturally, the answers were vague, statements were brief, and official documents hard to come by. But it gets stranger. In 1989, BCCI purchased a controlling interest in an Italian bank called Banca Nazionale del Lavoro, which had ties to Vatican-connected entities. That bank was later caught channeling billions of dollars in secret loans to Saddam Hussein's Iraq just before the Gulf War. That's right. A global financial scandal that touched Saddam Hussein, CIA-backed operations in Afghanistan, and charitable accounts linked to Vatican clergy. The full picture was never made public. BCCI collapsed in 1991, described by US officials as the most corrupt financial institution in the history of banking. Billions were lost. Thousands of transactions vanished into a fog of offshore holdings. And the Vatican? Once again, it issued a statement, expressed regret, and closed the door. No convictions, no paper trail, no apology. Just the quiet rustle of red folders being moved to deeper shelves. If you've been wondering when the mob would show up in this story, don't worry. They're here because no tale of secret money, untraceable accounts, and convenient silence would be complete without a few gentlemen in well-ironed suits and suspiciously clean shoes. Enter the Italian mafia, and one man at the center of it all, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. Tall, American, a former bodyguard for the Pope. He looked more like a retired linebacker than a Vatican banker. And yet from the 1970s through the early 1990s, Marcinkus was the head of the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. Under his leadership, the Vatican Bank was pulled into two massive financial scandals. One of them involved the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano. The other involved mafia money, lots of it. According to multiple investigations, the Vatican Bank was used knowingly or not to launder funds for the Banda della Magliana, a criminal organization based in Rome with ties to both the mafia and far-right political groups. It wasn't just petty cash. We're talking millions moving through shell companies, charitable accounts, and cash-heavy real estate deals, all conveniently shielded by religious status. After all, who audits the Pope? Marcinkus always denied wrongdoing. When questioned, he smiled, politely shrugged his very large shoulders, and insisted that the Vatican Bank was simply a spiritual institution with a few accounting hiccups. But Italian prosecutors weren't convinced. They tried to issue a warrant for his arrest. Vatican City, being a sovereign state, refused to extradite him. Marcinkus stayed inside the walls, untouchable. One Italian official described it as a legal Bermuda Triangle. Things went in, but nothing ever came out. And then there was the murder. In 1982, shortly after the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, a young woman named Emanuela Orlandi, a Vatican citizen, vanished without a trace. Some believe it was connected to the Vatican's debts to the mafia. A form of pressure. A message. No body was ever found. No charges were filed. And Marcinkus, he quietly retired, moved back to the United States, played golf in Arizona until his death in 2006. He was never convicted of anything, never even went to trial. But for years afterward, whenever reporters tried to follow the money, they ran into a wall of silence, and sometimes a wall of cassocks. Deep beneath Vatican City, down stone staircases, and through heavy wooden doors, sits one of the most mysterious collections of documents in the world, the Vatican Apostolic Archive. For centuries it was simply called the Vatican Secret Archive, which sounds dramatic. And to be fair, it kind of is. This is where the church keeps over 50 miles of shelving, ancient letters, papal decrees, royal correspondences, manuscripts written by emperors, confessions scribbled under candlelight. It is quite literally the locked diary of Western civilization. And for most of history, almost no one was allowed to read it. Until recently, even scholars needed special permission from the Pope himself. And even then, they could only request specific documents by exact name without actually knowing what was in them, which made things challenging. But perhaps the most famous story buried in these archives is the story of Galileo Galilei. In the early 1600s, Galileo dared to say something dangerous, that the earth moves around the sun. The church disagreed. They preferred the earth to stay still, both literally and theologically. So in 1633, Galileo was tried by the Roman Inquisition. Inside a Vatican building, in front of cardinals, behind closed doors, he was found vehemently suspect of heresy, forced to recant, placed under house arrest, and for centuries, his full trial transcript was kept locked away in the archive. No one could see it. Not historians, not scientists, not even friendly Jesuits with nice handwriting. Only in the 19th and 20th centuries did portions of it become public. And when they did, they painted a more complicated picture, not of a cartoon villain, church silencing truth, but of a nervous political institution caught between dogma pride and the threat of scientific revolution. Eventually, the Vatican formally acknowledged its mistake. In 1992, 3.5 centuries later, Pope John Paul II expressed regret over the treatment of Galileo. He didn't exactly say sorry, but it was close. Still, the Galileo case is just one of the archive's secrets. Thousands of others remain sealed. Documents related to World War II, to papal decisions during the Holocaust, to internal church conflicts, no one speaks about anymore. The archive is slowly opening, but only a few years at a time. At this rate, it could be another century before certain files are made public. Which raises the question, what's still down there, quietly collecting dust, waiting for the world to be ready? Becoming a saint is not as easy as lighting candles and having a miracle or two. There's paperwork, lots of it, witnesses, investigations. And historically, there was someone whose job was to say, hold on, are we sure? That person was called the Devil's Advocate. Yes, it's a real title, not a nickname, not a movie. An official position in the church going back centuries. The Devil's Advocate, or more formally, the Promoter Fidei, was responsible for arguing against canonization. Their job was to question everything, test the candidate's morality, poke holes in the miracles, ask uncomfortable questions. It was a bit like putting a saint on trial. But instead of a judge and jury, there were cardinals and Latin. This role helped maintain the credibility of sainthood. Because frankly, once you start declaring people saints, you want to be careful. You don't want someone canonized for political convenience or public relations. But over time, something changed. By the late 20th century, the process of canonization became faster, more streamlined, and some might say more strategic. In 1983, under Pope John Paul II, the rules were revised. The Devil's Advocate was not abolished, but the role was softened, muted, absorbed into a broader advisory process. And then the numbers started climbing. John Paul II canonized over 480 saints during his pontificate. That's more than all previous popes combined. Some were widely admired figures. Others were more controversial. There were whispers that certain canonizations were political statements, messages to particular regions, regimes, or religious movements. One canonization, for instance, caused tension with China. Another was seen as a gesture to Latin America. Even the decision to canonize John Paul II himself, just 9 years after his death, remarkably fast by church standards, raised eyebrows among historians. Now, to be clear, canonization is still a rigorous process. But without a strong devil's advocate, the balance of scrutiny tilted. Who decides what qualifies as heroic virtue? What counts as a miracle? And when does devotion become branding? These are not easy questions. And in a church built on centuries of tradition, they rarely come with easy answers. But one thing is certain, even sainthood has its politics. And sometimes, even heaven has a review committee. The Vatican is small, less than half a square kilometer, smaller than a mid-sized shopping mall. No army, no oil, no factories. But somehow, it's always in the room. Even during the Cold War, when superpowers raced to stockpile missiles and ideologies, the Vatican sat quietly at the center of global influence. Officially, the Holy See is a neutral state. It doesn't take sides in wars. It doesn't vote in the UN. But what it does have is reach. At the height of the Cold War, the Vatican had diplomatic relations with over 100 countries. It had ambassadors called nuncios in cities from Washington to Warsaw. And most importantly, it had eyes and ears on both sides of the Iron Curtain. One of its most powerful diplomatic figures was Pope John Paul II, a native of Poland and a man who had lived under both Nazi occupation and Soviet control. He knew firsthand what authoritarianism looked like. And behind the scenes, he became an unexpected player in Cold War politics. In the 1980s, John Paul II quietly supported Solidarity, the labor movement challenging Poland's communist regime. He sent letters, met with leaders, and encouraged peaceful resistance from inside the system. Meanwhile, over in Washington, the Reagan administration noticed. Documents now suggest there was informal coordination between the Vatican and the CIA, a shared interest in weakening the Eastern Bloc from within. Was it official policy? No. Was it intentional influence? Almost certainly. The Vatican's support gave moral weight to the movement. Its networks helped spread information. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, more than one Western leader thanked the Pope. Publicly, the Church remained neutral. Privately, it had helped tilt the board. But even then, diplomacy wasn't simple. The Vatican also maintained relations with Cuba, held delicate discussions with China, and tried to mediate peace in Latin America and Africa, often through quiet meetings, coded letters, and careful phrases. It became a master of soft power, of saying things without quite saying them, of being everywhere without ever looking like it was. To this day, Vatican diplomacy remains one of the most mysterious branches of global politics. Polite, symbolic, but never irrelevant. It doesn't drop bombs. It doesn't impose sanctions. It just speaks and waits. And sometimes that's more powerful than anything else. For over 2,000 years, the Vatican has stood still. As empires rose and fell, as ideologies burned and faded, as whispers circled through palaces, prisons, and back rooms. Inside its walls are priceless treasures, towering basilicas, and silence, the kind of silence that comes not from absence, but from knowing. It is a place of faith, but also finance, of miracles and maneuvering, a city-state no larger than a neighborhood. And yet, its shadow stretches across continents and centuries. We've seen how bankers vanished beneath bridges, how fugitives disappeared through corridors of mercy, how saints were debated like legislation, and how diplomacy whispered beneath stained glass windows. Not everything is conspiracy. Not everything is proof. But history is rarely clean. And the deeper you go, the more you realize, in a place built on mystery, even the facts have footnotes. The Vatican is many things: a beacon of belief, a keeper of secrets, a participant quietly, carefully in the machinery of power. And somewhere in the hush between ancient marble walls, you might just hear the echoes of choices made long ago, still shaping the world we live in now. If you're still not asleep, let's continue with a brotherhood that has existed for centuries. No pope, no holy book, no official religion, only silent oaths, ancient symbols, and meetings not meant for the public. Tonight we step into the quiet world of Freemasonry. Freemasonry began in a surprisingly practical way. Around the 14th century in Europe, groups of stonemasons, real ones, with chisels and dust on their boots, started forming local guilds. They built cathedrals. They measured in sunlight and sacred geometry. Their tools weren't just practical, they were symbolic. Over time, these trade guilds began to change. They started admitting non-Masons gentlemen who were educated, curious, and eager to exchange ideas. And so the guilds became lodges, places of ritual philosophy and private conversation. There's no central headquarters, no global leader, just local chapters called lodges scattered across the world, each sharing a core set of ideals. Those ideals focus on three things: intellectual freedom, human dignity, and reason. The rituals are old, the symbols even older. The square stands for fairness, the compass moral boundaries, and light, not divine but intellectual, represents enlightenment. On the surface, it all seems rather peaceful, almost like a philosophy club, with candles. But that independence, the absence of any single doctrine or spiritual authority, is exactly what made Freemasonry deeply suspicious in the eyes of certain institutions, especially the Catholic Church. And that is where our story will turn next. But for now, if your eyes are heavy and your breathing is steady, perhaps you're ready to drift a little deeper. To understand why the Vatican spent centuries opposing Freemasonry, you have to understand something simple. Freemasonry doesn't answer to anyone, not to kings, not to popes, not even to its own history. It believes in a higher power, yes, but not necessarily God in the way the Catholic Church defines him. It allows for belief, but not doctrine. And for the Church, that's dangerous. For centuries, the Catholic worldview was built on authority, divine revelation, apostolic succession, a clear chain of command stretching from heaven to Rome. Freemasonry, on the other hand, was built on reason, the idea that human beings could and should discover truth through logic learning and free inquiry. That made the Vatican nervous. Because if truth could come from the mind, why turn to the Church? But it wasn't just the philosophy. It was the rituals, the oaths, the secrecy. Lodges held private ceremonies. Members took lifelong vows. Symbols were shared only within the brotherhood. To outsiders, especially religious ones, this looked a lot like an alternative religion, one without sacraments, without salvation, and worst of all, without the Pope. And so, in 1738, Pope Clement XII issued a papal bull titled In Eminenti. It was short, direct, and absolute. No Catholic may join the Masons. He called the lodges dangerous to church and state. He warned of moral corruption, disobedience, and heresy. And he made the punishment clear: automatic excommunication. Other popes followed. They repeated the ban, strengthened it, expanded it. By the 19th century, Freemasonry had become, in the eyes of the Church, not just a misguided fraternity, but a spiritual rival, one that operated in the dark, one that recruited from the educated, and one that was quietly growing everywhere. It wasn't paranoia. Freemasonry really was spreading across Europe, the Americas, and beyond. And many of its members were men of influence, judges, professors, statesmen, even clergy. So the Vatican held its ground again and again, century after century, even into modern times. And yet, despite all the warnings, despite all the declarations, the two worlds kept watching each other from a distance, curious, wary, unwilling to touch, but unable to ignore. The Catholic Church doesn't take many things lightly, and when it does speak out, it tends to be very thorough. So when the Vatican decided to condemn Freemasonry, it didn't just issue a warning and move on. It wrote documents, it passed decrees, it kept going for over 2 centuries. The first official condemnation came in 1738 under Pope Clement XIII with the papal bull In Eminenti Apostolatus. It declared that Masonic lodges were gatherings of men in secrecy, bound by oaths unknown to the law of church or state. The penalty excommunication. No sacraments, no confession, cut off from the church. The Pope warned that Freemasonry could corrupt faith, undermine governments, and lead the faithful into spiritual confusion. And that was just the beginning. In the years that followed, at least 8 more popes issued similar condemnations, each one reaffirming the same core concern, that Freemasonry promoted a philosophy of relativism where truth is chosen, not revealed, where personal reason overrides divine authority. The Church saw this as not just theologically dangerous, but existentially threatening. Because if people could be moral without confession, without Mass, without Rome, then what role did the Church play? In 1821, Pope Pius VII called Freemasonry a monstrous conspiracy against the Church. In 1884, Pope Leo XIII issued the encyclical Humanum Genus, which went even further, accusing the Masons of plotting to destroy Christianity itself. It was a harsh accusation, and yet many Catholics believed it. Some still do. By the 20th century, the tone began to soften slightly. The Church was facing new challenges: modernism, secularism, 2 world wars. Freemasonry was no longer seen as the enemy, just one of several. But the ban remained. And then, in 1983, a curious thing happened. The Church released a new code of canon law. The section on Freemasonry was gone. No mention of it. No explicit ban. No footnote. Had the Church changed its mind? Well, not quite. Just months after the new code was published, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, issued a clarification on behalf of the Vatican. It said, "The faithful who enroll in Masonic associations are in a state of grave sin and may not receive Holy Communion." In other words, yes, it's still banned. No, we're not putting it in writing anymore. But we're watching, always watching, whenever 2 powerful systems avoid each other for too long. The silence between them starts to echo. And into that silence, people begin to whisper. Freemasonry and the Vatican, 2 ancient institutions, both cloaked in ritual, both accused of secrecy, both claiming a kind of moral authority. It didn't take long before the world began to wonder, what if their conflict wasn't just theological? What if it was something deeper? Some conspiracy theories say that Freemasonry has spent centuries trying to infiltrate the Catholic Church from within. That certain bishops, Even cardinals were covert Masons. That decisions at church councils were shaped not by prayer, but by unseen hands. Of course, there's very little proof. Theories stretch across decades and continents, often with vague names, missing documents, or second-hand confessions. But the rumors persist. One of the most common claims is that the Second Vatican Council, a major reform movement in the 1960s, was secretly influenced by Masonic ideology. Why? Because it emphasized interfaith dialogue, religious freedom, open discussion even with non-believers. To some, that looked suspiciously like Freemasonry's core philosophy: tolerance, pluralism, and reason. Others point to mysterious deaths, like the sudden passing of Pope John Paul V in 1978, just 33 days after his election. Some say he was planning to clean up the Vatican Bank. Some say he had a list of church officials tied to Freemasonry. And some say he knew too much. Again, no hard evidence, just fragments, just names that appear in the same footnotes. And then there's the other side. Within Masonic circles, some believe the Church has spent centuries demonizing Freemasonry out of fear, that the Vatican resents any movement it can't control, that it paints Masonry as anti-Christian simply because it offers a different spiritual path. In this version, Freemasonry isn't a secret overlord, but a scapegoat, a convenient enemy in robes and symbols. So which version is true? Maybe neither, maybe both. Maybe the story is less about facts and more about fear, because when two worlds build walls between them, those walls become screens. And on those screens, we project all our anxieties about power, about belief, about the shadows that move when no one's watching. By the 1970s, Italy was full of shadows: political unrest, economic crisis, bombings in train stations, red brigades, black hands, too many names, not enough faces. And somewhere beneath it all, there was a lodge, a secret one. Its name was Propaganda Due, or simply P2. Officially, P2 was a Masonic lodge based in Rome. Unofficially, it was something else entirely. It didn't focus on enlightenment. It didn't discuss symbols or virtue. It wasn't interested in ancient wisdom or geometry. It was interested in power. Led by a man named Licio Gelli, P2 quietly recruited a network of men from the highest levels of Italian life: politicians, military generals, intelligence officers, bankers, even a few people close to the Vatican. At its peak, P2 had nearly 1,000 members, many of them operating in secret on both sides of the law. Its stated goal was the moral rebirth of Italy. But behind that noble phrase were documents suggesting plans for surveillance, censorship, and political manipulation. In 1981, Italian authorities raided Kelly's villa. What they found was more than expected: a list of names, typed, organized, numbered, a parallel government, hidden in plain sight. Among the names were heads of banks, heads of state media, high-ranking military and law enforcement, and several individuals rumored to be connected to Vatican institutions, especially the Vatican Bank. P2 was also linked to the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, the same scandal that left Roberto Calvi hanging under a bridge in London his pockets stuffed with bricks. The lodge had Masonic structure, but its goals were political. Its tools were not compasses and squares, but bribes, blackmail, and back channels. After the revelations, the Italian government banned P2. Its members scattered. Some resigned quietly. Some faced trial. Some simply disappeared. But the connection to the Vatican remained murky. Officially, the Church condemns Freemasonry in all forms. Unofficially, P2 may have been the exception that slipped through the cracks, or climbed through them. Did the Vatican knowingly cooperate? Did individuals act alone? Was it ignorance or convenience? We still don't know. But for one brief, bizarre chapter in Italian history, a secret Masonic lodge seemed to sit exactly between the sacred and the profane, with one hand on the Bible and the other on a suitcase full of cash. Centuries have passed. Empires have come and gone. Wars have ended. Popes have changed. But the distance between the Vatican and Freemasonry still remains. Today, both institutions continue to exist, each still powerful in its own way, each still wearing the weight of history. Freemasonry holds meetings in quiet halls. It hosts lectures, supports charities, and carries out rituals many would call symbolic, even theatrical. It promotes freedom of thought inquiry and individual conscience. And the Vatican, it still maintains its position that membership in Masonic organizations is incompatible with the Catholic faith, that the values of Freemasonry, however modern or benevolent they may seem, do not align with the Church's understanding of divine truth. The Church no longer shouts this from the pulpit, but it still prints it quietly. In footnotes, circulars, and reminders to clergy. Still, the world has changed. In some countries, Catholics and Masons now live side by side. In others, one person may quietly be both attending Mass on Sunday and a lodge meeting on Thursday. In places like Germany, Austria, and the United States, local attitudes are more relaxed. The two worlds glance at each other now and then, but no longer raise alarms. And yet, there is no formal reconciliation, no handshake, no shared table, because the differences aren't just doctrinal, they're philosophical. One believes in revealed truth, the other believes in seeking it. One trusts hierarchy, the other trusts the individual mind. And so they remain where they've always been, two parallel systems, both claiming to serve the good, but moving through the world on different tracks, watching each other, occasionally bumping shoulders, but never quite meeting eye to eye. Some stories have a clear ending, a resolution, a truth that fits neatly into a sentence. This is not one of those stories. The relationship between the Vatican and Freemasonry has always been shaped more by tension than by clarity, by silence more than speech. On one side, a church rooted in revelation mystery and obedience. On the other, a brotherhood built on reason inquiry and inner light. They are not enemies in the way wars have enemies, but they are not allies either. Their conflict lives in symbols, in creeds, in the space between dogma and doubt. Over the centuries, both have faced suspicion. Both have been accused of hiding too much, and both in their own ways have shaped the world behind closed doors. Maybe that's what makes their standoff so enduring. Not because one is right and the other is wrong, but because they are two ways of understanding truth, two paths winding toward the same mountain, but never crossing. In the quiet hours, some wonder if they will ever meet. Others hope they never do. And maybe that's the point. Maybe there are some questions that were never meant to be resolved, only explored. So we leave them here still watching each other, still circling in ritual and silence, each holding a torch, each convinced the other walks in shadow. And you, dear listener, you get to decide which light you find more comforting.